The air conditioning in the restaurant was set to the same crisp 72 degrees it always was, but I felt a chill crawl over my bare arms that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the kind of cold that starts somewhere behind your ribs and works its way out. Across the table, my husband was giving his phone more attention than the $80 steak cooling on his plate. The faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth wasn't meant for me. It belonged to whatever glowed on the other side of that screen, and I knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually changes color, that it belonged to someone else entirely. I set my fork down carefully, the way you set down something breakable, so it wouldn't make a sound and interrupt whatever quiet pleasure he was having without me. This had been my life for 6 months. Nathaniel would come home from the firm, drop his briefcase by the door like it weighed nothing and everything at once, take a shower, and then attach himself to that phone like it was breathing for him. Our conversations had shrunk down to logistics. Had I eaten? What time was his thing tomorrow? Did I need him to pick up dry cleaning? How did the Halloran deal go today? I asked. My voice came out thinner than I wanted it to. I was reaching for something, anything, to close the distance that had opened up between us without my ever agreeing to it. He looked up, and it took his eyes a full second to focus on me, like he'd been somewhere far away and had to travel back. Fine, same as always, he said, and his thumb was already moving again, that quick, practiced dance across the glass. I took a breath and reminded myself of who I was outside this table. I hadn't always been the woman waiting for her husband to look up from his phone. I'd built something. My company, Whitman and Company, had grown from a single rented storefront into 3 boutiques scattered across Manhattan, and the portfolio I managed myself, late at night after everyone else had gone to sleep, had grown into something that quietly dwarfed his partner-track salary. I was a woman who solved problems for a living. I found the crack in a bad lease, the flaw in a supplier's contract, the soft spot in a competitor's pricing, and I exploited it before anyone else even saw it was there. But in my own marriage, I had no leverage at all. I only had hope, and hope is not a strategy. I told myself it was a phase, a rut, the kind of thing marriages survive if you're patient enough. That night, my hope died. After the silent dinner, Nathaniel didn't disappear into his home office like he usually did. He followed me into the living room instead and sat across from me on the sofa and set his phone face down on the coffee table. That gesture, small as it was, made my stomach drop. He never put that phone down. Not for me. Ella, I need to tell you something. His voice was flat, level. The voice of a doctor about to hand you a diagnosis he'd already rehearsed in the mirror. I nodded. My heart had started pounding somewhere up in my throat. My hands, folded in my lap, had gone cold and damp without my permission. I think our marriage is over, he said, staring at a spot on the wall just behind my head, refusing to actually look at me. I've thought about this for a long time. I want a divorce. The word hung in the air between us like something sharp had been dropped and hadn't finished falling yet. The grandfather clock in the hallway, which had always been a comforting sound, a heartbeat for the house, now sounded like something striking an anvil. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. There was a stone lodged in my throat where words should have been. He took my silence for surrender. You didn't do anything wrong, Elle. You've been a good wife. But I can't keep lying to myself. I'm still in love with Vanessa. Vanessa. The name landed like a slap. His college girlfriend, the one he'd broken up with 8 years before he ever met me, the one he'd occasionally bring up in some nostalgic story at a dinner party, always with that same soft, faraway look. The look that made me feel like I was standing in for someone else in a play I hadn't auditioned for. We started talking again a few months ago, he said, without a trace of shame in his voice, and we realized we never should have broken up. I want to start over with her. I found my voice, though it came out cracked and small. Start over? Yes. He nodded like it was the most obvious, most reasonable thing in the world. To do that cleanly, we should just split everything down the middle. This house, the savings, the investments. It's only fair. Fair. That word was the second slap, and it hurt worse than the first. This house had been paid off with the bonuses from my company. Nearly every dollar in our savings, in our brokerage accounts, had come from my boutiques and from trades I'd made myself, staying up until 2 in the morning reading earnings reports while he slept. His salary barely covered the loan on his BMW and our grocery bill. But in his mind, none of that mattered. It was all just ours, the second he decided he wanted out. Half of it his to carry off toward a new life with another woman. I didn't answer. I just looked at him. This man who had slept beside me for 7 years, whose career I had quietly supported through every late night and every bruised ego after a lost case. This man I had genuinely, stupidly loved. And in that moment, he didn't look like my husband ending a marriage. He looked like an opposing counsel closing a deal. I didn't sleep that night. At 2 in the morning, I got up for water, and as I passed his office, the door cracked just slightly open. I heard his voice. It wasn't flat anymore. It was warm, full of a kind of laughter I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. Just a little longer, baby. It'll all be over soon. I stopped walking. The process is going to be fast. I already told her. A pause. I held my breath and pressed myself against the wall beside the door. How'd she take it? Shocked, obviously. But she's weak. She always has been. A soft laugh. She won't fight me on it. Elle's too wrapped up in me. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. Another pause. And then, quieter, sweeter, like a secret he was cradling. Don't worry, love. All her money, our money, it's going to be the foundation for our whole new life. You can quit your job. We'll finally travel like we always talked about. Our money, our new life. Those two phrases hit me like a current running straight through my chest. The pain that had been sitting there since dinner turned instantly, completely, to ice. Whatever tears had been building behind my eyes simply evaporated. I backed away from that door slowly, my hands curling into fists so tight my knuckles went white, and I walked back to our bedroom. But I didn't get into bed. I stood in front of the long mirror in the corner of the room and looked at the woman staring back at me. Puffy eyes, a pale, tired face. A woman who had just been called weak, in her own house, by the man who was supposed to protect her from the world, not sell her out to it. But that isn't what I saw in my own eyes. What I saw was a flame just starting to catch. Cold, focused, patient. My pain had converted itself in the space of about 90 seconds into something else entirely. Resolve. Nathaniel was about to learn how wrong he was. This would be over fast, exactly like he wanted, but not one bit the way he imagined it. I wasn't going to give him a court battle, because by the time he understood what had happened, there would be nothing left in the middle to fight over. I was going to take back every dollar, every share, every square foot of what I had built with my own hands, my own sleepless nights, my own risk. In the dark of that room, I made myself a promise. He could keep his past with Vanessa. I was taking my entire future. The sun came up like it always did, indifferent to the fact that my whole world had rearranged itself overnight. When I came down for breakfast, Nathaniel was already at the table with his coffee, scrolling the news on his tablet. He glanced up when I walked in, and I saw the flicker of surprise cross his face. I did not look like a woman whose life had collapsed 12 hours earlier. I'd already showered. I was wearing a crisp navy silk blouse, my hair pulled back into a clean, deliberate chignon. No trace of tears anywhere on my face, just an almost eerie calm. "Morning," I said, my voice even. I reached for a piece of toast and spread jam on it with slow, unhurried movements. "Morning?" he said back, a little awkward, watching me like he was trying to read a language he didn't speak. "You doing okay?" "I'll be fine," I said, meeting his eyes without blinking. "I thought about what you said last night. You're right. No point holding on to something that's already broken. Let's just end this peacefully." He visibly relaxed. A small, satisfied smile crept onto his mouth. Just like he'd predicted on the phone, I was being reasonable. Compliant. No drama. "I'm glad you can see it that way, Elle. You've taken a real weight off my shoulders." "I just need some time alone today," I continued, keeping my tone soft, tired, defeated. "To sit with it. I'll work from the home office. Don't worry about me." Of course, of course. Take all the time you need." He said it in that magnanimous tone men use when they think they've just won something without a fight. He finished his coffee, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the door with a spring in his step, thoroughly convinced the biggest obstacle in his path had just quietly removed itself. The second his car engine faded down the street, my mask dropped. I didn't cry. My jaw set, and my eyes went cold and clear. Instead of retreating to the bedroom to fall apart, I walked briskly to my office, locked the door, something I almost never bothered to do, and opened the safe hidden behind the landscape painting on the wall. Inside wasn't just jewelry, it was thick binders of paper. The deed to the house. The title to the pre-war apartment I'd inherited from my parents. Lease agreements for all 3 boutiques. Years of brokerage statements. The incorporation documents for Whitman and Company. I spread it all across my desk like a general laying out a battlefield map, opened my laptop, and started building a spreadsheet. I split it into 3 columns. Column 1. Mine, exclusively. Assets I'd owned before the marriage. My old apartment. Some gold my grandmother left me. Legally untouchable. But I knew a good enough lawyer could still make noise about it if he was hungry enough. Column 2. Built by my own 2 hands. This column ran the longest. The house, paid off entirely with my bonuses. The Hamptons house, held under Whitman and Co.'s name. The boutiques and everything in them. The stock and bond portfolio, now sitting somewhere north of $30 million. Every cent of it traceable to my income, my trades, my work. Column 3. Actually, ours. I almost laughed out loud when I got here. 1 item. A joint checking account that rose and fell with grocery bills, and 2 cars. Mine paid in cash, his still financed. Seeing it all laid out on the screen in black and white made the anger crystallize into something almost clean. His idea of splitting everything 50-50 wasn't a divorce settlement. It was daylight robbery with a law degree attached. My hand hovered over my phone. My finger hesitated over the name of the attorney our company usually used. No. He knew that lawyer too. I needed someone new. Someone unexpected. Someone with teeth. I remembered a name a colleague had mentioned once at a fundraiser, in a hushed, half-admiring voice. A divorce attorney people called the wolf in a cardigan, because he looked like your favorite uncle and fought like something out of a nature documentary. I found the firm online, Kane and Associates. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. "Good morning, Kane and Associates." "Good morning. I need to speak with Desmond Kane. It's urgent," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. After a short hold, a calm, low voice came on the line. "Desmond Kane speaking." "My name is Elle Whitman. I got your information from a friend. I need a private consultation as soon as possible. It's about a divorce and protecting my assets." "Has a petition already been filed?" he asked. No wasted words. "No," I said quickly, "and I need everything settled before it is. I don't want to fight a war in court. I want the war to be finished before my opponent even realizes it's started. There was a pause on the line, like he was weighing something. I like your approach, Ms. Whitman. Can you come to my office at noon? No, I said. I can't be seen walking into a divorce attorney's building. Can we meet somewhere quieter? Another pause, and then his voice came back, this time carrying something that sounded like respect. There's a coffee shop in the West Village, the Daily Grind. It's quiet. Noon. After I hung up, I called the second person on my mental list. My broker, Nora Fitch, a pragmatic, no-nonsense woman who'd managed part of my portfolio for years. Nora, I need your help, I said, skipping any preamble. I'm divorcing Nathaniel. A pause. I'm so sorry to hear that, Elle. What do you need? I need to liquidate some positions, fast, but gradually, so it doesn't spook the market or draw attention. And I need a brand new brokerage account and a new bank account at a completely different institution. Nothing connected to what I already have. Total confidentiality. Understood, Nora said. Already all business. Send me the list of what you want sold first. I'll get the paperwork moving on the new accounts. We can run everything paperless so nothing gets mailed to the house. Thank you, Nora. I owe you. Don't mention it. Think of it as a portfolio reallocation, she said, a little dryly, trying to lighten the moment. After that call, I felt something steady settle into my chest for the first time in 24 hours. The gears were turning now. It was time to take my first real step. I logged into the joint account. Balance, about $40,000, most of it a dividend payment that had cleared 3 days earlier from one of my own holdings. Nathaniel had no idea where the money in that account actually came from. He just knew it was there when he needed it. I opened the transfer screen and typed in the account number for Whitman & Company. In the amount field, $30,000. In the memo line, payment to suppliers, fall collection fabrics. A perfectly boring, perfectly true-sounding reason, one I could back up with an invoice in about 10 minutes if I ever needed to. My finger hovered over confirm. My heart was pounding. This was the point of no return, the first real move in a game that had, until this moment, only existed in my head. I clicked it. Transfer successful. I closed the laptop, put everything back in the safe, and locked it. Then I walked to the kitchen, brewed a cup of chamomile tea, and sat by the window looking out at the garden like a woman with absolutely nothing on her mind. When Nathaniel got home that night, he found me on the sofa with a book. Feeling any calmer? He asked. Yes, I said softly, closing the book. I'm ready to start the process whenever you are. He smiled, pleased with himself, with no idea whatsoever that the real process had already begun that morning, hours before he'd even finished his coffee. I didn't sleep much in the days that followed, and when I did, I kept surfacing out of dreams that weren't quite nightmares, just replays. Not of the restaurant, or the overheard phone call. Older ones. I kept landing back at the beginning, like some part of my brain needed to understand how exactly we'd gotten from there to here before it would let me move forward. I met Nathaniel 9 years ago, at a fundraiser I almost didn't go to. I was 26, 3 months into leasing my very first storefront. A narrow, oddly shaped space in Chelsea that used to be a dry cleaner and still smelled faintly of chemical solvent no matter how many candles I lit in it. I had exactly one employee, a part-time seamstress named Rosa, and a business plan held together mostly by stubbornness and a small loan from my mother that, at the time, was simply a gift. Freely given, no strings, no paperwork, nothing but her faith that I'd figure the rest out. Nathaniel was 29 then, a second-year associate at a firm everyone in the room seemed to respect, wearing a suit that fit him a little too well for someone who'd apparently been living on ramen and billable hours for 2 years straight. He found me standing alone near the bar, nursing a glass of wine I couldn't really afford to be drinking, and made some self-deprecating joke about corporate law being a slow, well-compensated form of death. I laughed harder than the joke deserved, mostly out of relief that someone in that room was talking to me like a person instead of a business card. He asked about my dress, not in the way men usually asked women about their clothes at those things, like it was a compliment they were performing, but like he actually wanted to know where the fabric came from, why I'd chosen that particular cut. I told him I'd made it myself. He looked genuinely surprised, then genuinely impressed, and something about the specific quality of his attention that night, focused, curious, entirely on me, made me feel like maybe I wasn't crazy for betting my whole life on a dry cleaner that smelled like solvent. We were engaged 14 months later. I remember my mother pulling me aside at the engagement dinner, not to warn me exactly, just to ask, quietly, whether I was sure. I remember laughing off the question. Of course I was sure. He drove out to Chelsea after work most nights just to help me hang inventory. He read every lease agreement before I signed it, catching a predatory clause in my second storefront's contract that would have cost me thousands. He sat with me at 2 in the morning when my first big trade show fell through and told me, with a conviction I believed completely, that I was going to build something enormous and that he intended to be standing next to me when I did. For a long time, he was exactly that. Supportive in the specific practical way that matters more than flowers ever do. He negotiated my first commercial lease down by $4,000 a year. He introduced me to two of my earliest wholesale buyers through contacts from his firm. When Whitman and Company opened its second location, he took an entire Saturday off, a rare thing for him even then, to help me build shelving with his own hands, ruining a good shirt in the process and laughing about it instead of complaining. I used to tell people back then that I'd married someone who believed in me before I'd given him much reason to. I meant it as the highest compliment I had. The slow drift started somewhere around year 5. Though I didn't recognize it as a drift at the time, I recognized it as success. His success, mainly. He made partner 2 years ahead of the typical track, and the hours that came with it swallowed evenings, then weekends, then, eventually, most conversations that weren't strictly logistical. I told myself this was simply what ambition looked like from the outside, that partners' wives everywhere were having some version of this same season, and that seasons end. Mine kept my business growing too, quietly, steadily, in a way that required less of my attention than his career required of him, if only because I'd built systems and people I trusted around me by then. Walter had come on as a store manager in year 3 and never left. My mother, once her savings had grown comfortable, started quietly investing alongside me, watching numbers with the same sharp, pleased eyes she'd had the day she handed me that first check. Looking back now, I think the truth is that I got better at being alone inside my own marriage than I ever let myself admit. I filled the silence with spreadsheets, with new store openings, with a Saturday morning ritual of reading market reports over coffee that I told myself was just efficient use of time. And that was, if I'm honest, also a way of not sitting with how quiet the house had become. I don't think Nathaniel woke up one specific morning and decided to stop loving me. I think it was slower and sadder than that. A kind of erosion neither of us named out loud until Vanessa's name came back into his life and gave the erosion somewhere to go. I've turned that over more times than I'd like to admit since that night at the restaurant, whether there was a version of us where I noticed sooner, said something sooner, whether 5 years of quiet distance was a wound I could have stitched shut if I'd only looked up from my own laptop long enough to see it happening. I don't actually think it would have mattered. Some people love you as long as you're useful to the story they're telling about themselves, and the moment a better story walks back into the room, the old one gets filed away without much ceremony. I was a very good chapter in Nathaniel's story for 7 years. I just wasn't the ending he'd already decided he wanted. What I keep coming back to, lying awake those first nights after the restaurant, isn't even the betrayal itself. Betrayal, on some level, I could have forgiven. Given time, given honesty, given a version of this conversation that didn't involve carving up my company like a Thanksgiving turkey while he made calls to another woman from behind a door he thought was closed all the way. What I couldn't forgive, what turned the grief into something harder and colder inside me, was the arithmetic. The casual, confident math of a man who'd spent 7 years watching me build something out of nothing and had somehow, at the end of it, convinced himself he was entitled to half. That's the part I couldn't let go of. Not the loss of him. The insult of being so completely, deliberately underestimated by someone who'd had a front row seat to exactly how capable I was the entire time. So I stopped grieving somewhere around 3 in the morning on the third sleepless night, and I started planning instead. Grief, I decided, could wait until I had nothing left to protect. Right now, I had a company, a house, a portfolio, and a mother who would sign whatever I asked her to sign without a single unnecessary question, because she'd believed in me before anyone else had, and she wasn't about to stop now that it actually mattered. I didn't know the details of how Vanessa came back into Nathaniel's life until months later, some of it from that same rambling voicemail, some of it from a mutual acquaintance who felt, I think, guilty enough about knowing and not telling me sooner that she eventually spilled everything over lunch. Unprompted. The words tumbling out of her like a confession she'd been carrying too long. It started, apparently, the way these things usually do, mundanely, almost accidentally. A mutual friend from his college years had added him to a group chat organizing a reunion weekend, and Vanessa, invited to the same reunion, had messaged him directly a few days before the event. Something breezy and nostalgic. "Do you remember when? Wasn't it wild that?" The kind of message designed to feel harmless while quietly testing whether a door long assumed closed might, in fact, still be slightly ajar. He told her, according to what I eventually pieced together, that he was married, happily, and that it was good to hear from her. She told him, in turn, some carefully edited version of her own life, a divorce 2 years prior that she framed as liberating rather than devastating, a career that had stalled out in ways she blamed on everyone except herself. A wistful comment about how she sometimes wondered what would have happened if they'd stayed together instead of drifting apart in their 20s. I understand, intellectually, how a conversation like that could feel flattering to a man who'd spent the last several years increasingly absorbed in work, increasingly distant from a wife who'd stopped demanding his attention because she'd built a whole life that didn't strictly require it. I understand, in the abstract, how nostalgia dressed up as coincidence can feel like fate to someone primed to want an escape hatch from a life that had quietly, without any single dramatic moment, stopped feeling like enough. I don't excuse it, but I understand the mechanism of it now in a way I couldn't when I was still inside the marriage, blindsided by a name I'd only ever heard in wistful, past tense stories. The reunion happened. They talked, apparently for hours, at a hotel bar after the official events wound down, and whatever spark had existed between them at 21 reignited fast enough that Nathaniel came home from that weekend, according to the friend who eventually told me all this, quieter than usual, distracted in a way she'd noticed even before I had. The texting started within a week. Innocuous at first, or framed that way. Then longer. Then later at night. Then, inevitably, in person, coffee that became dinner, that became whatever it eventually became, before he ever worked up the nerve to sit across from me on our own sofa and tell me our marriage was over. I've thought, since, about the version of events he must have told himself during those months. The story that let him look at himself in the mirror every morning while quietly building a second life behind a phone screen. I imagine it went something like this. that he and Vanessa had simply never gotten a fair shot the first time around. Too young, too broke, too unformed as people. That fate, or at least a college reunion committee, had corrected an old mistake by putting them back in the same room. That I was a good wife, genuinely, but that goodness and rightness weren't the same thing, and that he owed it to some deeper, truer version of himself to chase the life he'd apparently always actually wanted. It's a tidy story. It absolves him of almost everything, recasts betrayal as destiny, recasts 7 years of my life as a pleasant detour on the way to somewhere he was always going to end up regardless of what I did or didn't do to hold his attention. I don't believe it. Not anymore. Though I think for a while, in the earliest days after the restaurant, some wounded part of me wanted to believe it too. Because a story about fate hurts less than a story about a man simply getting bored and reaching for something easier the moment it presented itself. Fate, at least, isn't a judgment on you specifically. Boredom is. What I know now, with distance, is considerably less romantic than fate, and considerably more common than either of us probably wanted to admit at the time. He got restless. Someone from his past showed up at exactly the right or wrong moment, offering the specific, intoxicating flattery of being wanted by someone who remembered you at 21, before you'd accumulated a mortgage and a wife with her own thriving business and all the ordinary, unglamorous responsibilities of an actual adult life. He mistook that flattery for a sign, and by the time he worked up the nerve to act on it, he'd already built an entire justification in his head, sturdy enough to walk into our living room and ask me for a divorce without so much as a flicker of visible guilt. I don't know if Vanessa loved him, in whatever way she was capable of loving anyone. I know, from everything that happened after, that she loved the version of a life he'd promised her considerably more than she loved him specifically. And that the moment that promised life turned out to be built on assets that no longer existed, her feelings for him evaporated fast enough to give a person whiplash. I think, honestly, that's the saddest part of the whole story. Sadder even than my own betrayal, though it took me a long time to feel anything like sympathy for either of them. Nathaniel burned down 7 years of a genuinely good marriage chasing a fantasy that turned out to have no actual substance underneath it. No real loyalty, no real partnership, nothing but the same flattering nostalgia that had lured him back in the first place, now curdled into contempt the second the money disappeared. He didn't just lose me. He lost everything, chasing something that was never going to be there once he actually arrived. The daily grind was exactly the kind of place nobody would think to look for a woman planning to dismantle her own marriage. Mismatched chairs, the smell of burnt espresso, a college kid behind the counter who couldn't have cared less who walked in. I chose a table in the back, facing the door, and waited with my hands wrapped around a cup I had no intention of drinking. Desmond Kane turned out to be nothing like the wolf his reputation promised. He was in his 60s, soft around the middle, with a fatherly face and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like he should be teaching high school chemistry, not eviscerating people in family court. He spoke quietly. He listened without interrupting once while I told him everything: the restaurant, the divorce demand, the phone call I'd overheard through his office door. "The situation is actually very clear, Ms. Whitman," he said when I finished. "The key factor here is time. As long as no petition has been officially filed with the court, everything titled in your name legally belongs to you, and you're free to do whatever you want with it. Sell it, transfer it, restructure it." He folded his hands on the table. "We're not doing anything criminal. We're simply reorganizing your personal assets before someone else tries to lay claim to them." His plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would start with whatever was easiest to move and hardest to trace back to Nathaniel's name, the securities, first. The next afternoon, I was driving to check on the Chelsea boutique, Nora on speakerphone, my voice sounding businesslike and level while my actual heartbeat was doing something closer to a sprint. "Let's start with the tech holdings," I told her. "I can sell half your position in Dynacorp today," Nora said. "I'll spread it over 3 days so we don't move the price or attract attention. Everything routes straight into the new brokerage account." "Good. What about the treasury bonds?" "Those are simpler. 2 to 3 business days to liquidate. I can start today if you want." "Start it." I stopped at a red light a block later and a patrol car pulled up right beside me. The officer inside glanced over. Just an ordinary glance, the kind cops give every car at every light in this city. My heart slammed against my ribs anyway. An irrational, guilty fear washed over me even though I hadn't broken a single law. I was protecting what was mine. I reminded myself of that, took a slow breath, and when the light turned green, I drove on at exactly the speed limit, watching the patrol car shrink in my rearview mirror. It was a small moment, but it stuck with me the rest of the day. A reminder of exactly how much was riding on staying calm. At home, I had to stay alert every second. Nathaniel, increasingly consumed with whatever future he was building in his head with Vanessa, barely registered the details of our shared life anymore. But there were moments that still made my heart stop cold. One evening, he came home earlier than usual and found the mail stacked on the entryway console. He started sorting through it. "Elle, did your credit card statement come this month?" he asked, distracted, tearing open one of his own envelopes. My heart froze for a second. I'd switched everything to paperless a month ago. "Oh, I moved everything to email statements," I said, walking in from the kitchen with a glass of water for him. "Saves paper. It's easier." "Ah, makes sense," he mumbled, already absorbed in his own mail again. Another night, he looked up from his laptop. "I was checking the joint account. Balance seemed low. What did you spend it on?" I had the answer ready before he'd even finished the question. "I put a deposit down on the Italian silk for the new bridal line. I ran it through as a business expense, so it won't count toward what we split." I pulled up a fake order confirmation email on my phone, one I'd mocked up that morning, and showed it to him. He glanced at it, nodded, and went back to scrolling. He knew nothing about how my business actually ran, and he had no interest in learning now. Every small lie that landed cleanly, every secret transfer that cleared without a hitch, built my confidence a little more. I got better at covering my tracks. I ran a VPN every time I touched the hidden accounts. I talked to Desmond and Nora exclusively through an encrypted messaging app. I had become a ghost inside my own financial life. One night, long after Nathaniel had fallen asleep, I sat alone in my office with a spreadsheet open, one I'd titled Project Independence. It listed every asset I'd already secured. Nora had just confirmed the proceeds from the Dynacorp sale had landed safely in the new account. With something like cold satisfaction, I moved my cursor to the line that read Dynacorp Holdings and typed the word completed into the status column. I sat there looking at that single word for a moment. Every time I typed it, it felt like another step away from a life that had quietly become a cage, and a step toward one I would fully own. I closed the laptop. The performance I was putting on for Nathaniel every day felt heavy, but the weight lifting off my actual shoulders was so much lighter. I would keep playing the grieving, cooperative wife until the very last scene. And when the curtain finally dropped, I intended to take a bow he would never forget. With the liquid assets secured, I knew the next phase would be harder and far more dangerous. Stocks could vanish into a new account with a few clicks. Real estate could not. It was time to deal with the Hamptons house. We'd bought it 3 years earlier, not as a couple, but as an asset of Whitman and Company. That single fact was both a liability and, as it turned out, the key to protecting it. Selling it wasn't a quiet digital transaction. It required notaries, paperwork, actual buyers. This was where Desmond's role became essential. We met that time in a loud, crowded diner during the lunch rush, the kind of place where nobody would ever overhear a whispered conversation over the clatter of plates. "We'll run a legitimate sale," Desmond said, low enough that I had to lean in to hear him over the noise. "Whitman and Company sells the house. The buyer is a new entity we're setting up, Harbor Point Holdings, LLC. On paper, that LLC belongs entirely to your mother." I nodded slowly, following exactly where he was going. "So the money moves from my company's account into something my mother technically controls." "Exactly. On paper, it's gone from Whitman and Co.'s books completely, which means it can't be counted as part of the company's value in a settlement. In reality, it never leaves your family's hands. We'll price it just under market to make the timeline look natural, like you were simply eager to close fast." The wheels started turning. Desmond handled the paperwork for Harbor Point Holdings within days. I began preparing the sale documents through my most trusted employee, Walter Higgins, the property manager who'd been with me since the boutiques were still one cramped storefront in Chelsea. We had to move quickly. Every extra day the house sat listed was another chance for word of it to reach Nathaniel. That chance arrived faster than I expected, and in the worst possible way. One weekend, Nathaniel approached me in an unusually good mood. I had an idea." He hadn't used that soft, affectionate voice in months. "Let's take a drive out to the beach house next week. Bring Vanessa along, let her see it. Kind of a preview, before it's officially ours." My stomach dropped straight through the floor. It wasn't just tactless, it was a direct threat to everything I'd been building for weeks. "I don't want to go out there right now," I said, careful to sound tired instead of alarmed. "Too many memories." I paused, letting the excuse I'd already prepared slide out naturally. "Besides, it's listed for a long-term rental right now. Walter's handling it. There are a couple of serious parties looking at it this week. It's better if we don't get in the way. If we can get rental income going, that's good for both of us, isn't it?" The bait worked exactly like I'd hoped. At the mention of easy money, his eyes lit up. "Oh, that's smart. You really do have a knack for this stuff," he said, entirely blind to the irony sitting right there in his own sentence. "Fine, leave it to Walter. Tell him to push for the highest rent he can get." "We'll split whatever it brings in," I said, with a faint smile I had to work to hold steady. But Nathaniel was impulsive, and 3 days later he decided to drive out to the Hamptons alone, without telling me, using the excuse that he wanted to check on the house's condition before it went to renters. His real reason, I found out later, was to snap a few photos to show off to Vanessa. The second his car pulled into the driveway, my heart, 40 miles away, felt like it stopped completely. I'd just gotten a short text from Walter. "He's here. Don't worry, it's handled." Walter played his part flawlessly. He was there with a young couple, his own niece and her husband, dressed up as an eager pair of renters from overseas. "Good morning," Walter said smoothly as Nathaniel walked in, introducing himself only as the property manager, careful never to say whose property it actually was. "I'm the owner of this house," Nathaniel announced, glancing around the living room like he already owned the view. "My wife mentioned she's renting it out." "That's right. I'm here with a couple who flew in and are very interested," Walter said, gesturing toward his niece and her husband, who nodded politely on cue. Nathaniel looked pleased. He walked through the rooms, no doubt already picturing himself and Vanessa lounging by the pool, and even stopped to give Walter instructions like he was in charge of something. "Make sure whatever they pay comes in US dollars. This is a luxury property. And I want a report on all of this too. I need to be kept in the loop." "Of course," Walter said, perfectly courteous. "I'll be reporting to Elle, who's the CEO of the company that owns the property. She'll pass along whatever you need to know." Nathaniel frowned slightly at that. some small part of him bristling at being reminded who actually held the deed, but he let it go. After snapping a handful of photos, he left. The instant his car disappeared down the road, Walter called me. "That was close, Elle," he said, and I could hear the relief in his own exhale. "Thank you, Walter. You have no idea what this means to me," I said, my hand still trembling slightly around the phone. That close call lit a fire under everything. 2 days later, the sale agreement between Whitman and Company and Harbor Point Holdings was signed in Desmond's office. Tens of millions of dollars moved that same afternoon into an account Nathaniel would never be able to touch. That night, I stood at my bedroom window for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. I'd defended another piece of my life, but the victory didn't feel like victory. It felt like I was dismantling the structure of everything we'd built, brick by brick, just to keep it out of the hands of the man who was supposed to be building it with me. Every step forward in this plan felt like a step back from some memory I used to treasure. But there was no version of this where I turned back. I had to keep pulling the thread until nothing was left tangled in his greed. With the house secured, I faced the hardest target of all: Whitman and Company itself. That business wasn't just a source of income. It was every hour I'd ever stolen from sleep, every risk I'd taken when nobody believed in me, every idea I'd fought to bring to life when the bank wouldn't return my calls. Giving Nathaniel half of it would have been like handing over half of who I was. Selling wasn't an option. I couldn't walk away from what I'd built from a single rented storefront. The plan Desmond and I built instead was more elegant and considerably riskier. 7 years earlier, when I was opening that very first store, my mother had given me some initial money to help cover the lease and first inventory order. It hadn't been much, relatively speaking, but it had been enough to get the doors open. At the time, it was simply a gift. No paperwork, no repayment terms, nothing but her faith in me and a hug in her kitchen. Now that gift needed to become a loan. Desmond drafted a backdated promissory note, meticulously worded, stating that my mother had loaned me that early capital, and that if it wasn't repaid in cash within 7 years, the debt would convert into a 75% equity stake in Whitman and Company. The document was built to hold up under scrutiny. "This is an aggressive move, Elle," Desmond warned me over our encrypted channel. "But legally, it's hard to unwind, especially since there's an actual bank transfer on record from your mother to you from all those years ago. We can argue that transfer was a loan disbursement all along. In court, it comes down to your mother's word against your husband's, and judges tend to trust paper trails over accusations, especially in family business disputes." I agreed without hesitation. I would rather take that risk than hand over my life's work on a silver platter. The next step meant bringing in Walter fully. One afternoon, I called him into my office at the flagship store, shut the door, and poured us both tea. "Walter," I said, "I'm divorcing Nathaniel." He looked at me with concern, but not surprise. He'd worked close enough to me for long enough to have sensed things weren't right for a while now. "I'm sorry to hear that. Whatever you decide, I'm behind you," he said simply. "That's exactly why I need your help. Nathaniel believes he's entitled to half of this company, the one you and I built from nothing. I can't let that happen, Walter. This isn't only about me, it's about your future, and the future of every single person on our payroll who depends on this place staying mine." I explained the ownership transfer to my mother as settling an old debt, careful not to mention the promissory note had been drafted the week before. I framed it as a long overdue obligation I finally needed to make right. His loyalty never wavered. "Understood. What do you need from me?" "I need every internal financial summary, every balance sheet, every profit and loss statement. All of it reflecting an unpaid debt to my mother going back years. It has to look consistent, natural, like it's always been sitting there." We spent the next week working late, combing through old ledgers, inserting notations that supported the loan history, preparing everything for a shareholders' meeting that existed purely on paper. Only I, as majority owner, and a handful of trusted managers with small incentive shares would attend. Every one of them loyal enough to approve whatever I put in front of them without a second thought. On the appointed day, we finalized the ownership transfer in Desmond's office. My mother, a kind-faced retiree with the same sharp eyes she'd passed down to me, signed the paperwork without asking a single unnecessary question. She just took my hand afterward and said, "Take back what's yours, sweetheart." With her signature and the notary's seal, 75% of Whitman and Company officially belonged to her. I stayed on as CEO, running everything day to day exactly as I always had. But on paper, I was no longer the majority owner of my own company. Its true value now sat somewhere Nathaniel could never legally reach. That evening, once it was done, I stood alone in the closed flagship store, running my fingers over the dresses on the mannequins, feeling the fabric I'd fought so hard to source. I'd saved my kingdom, but the victory tasted bittersweet, like I was a general who'd had to scorch her own fields just to keep them out of an invading army's hands. I'd protected my business by giving up the title that said I owned it outright. It was a painful trade, but a necessary one. I looked at myself in the mirror in the corner of the room. Tired eyes, but underneath the tiredness, something unshakable was burning. The war wasn't over yet, but my fortress was standing. I told exactly one person outside of Desmond, Nora, Walter, and my mother what I was actually doing, and that was my younger sister Dana. I hadn't planned to. Dana lived out in Westchester with her husband and 2 kids, blissfully removed from the version of my life that involved encrypted messaging apps and backdated promissory notes. And some part of me wanted to keep her that way, uninvolved, unimplicated, safe from whatever legal fallout might eventually land on the rest of us if anything went sideways. But she called me on a random Tuesday, just to check in, the way she did every few weeks. And something in my voice must have given me away, because halfway through a sentence about the boutiques she stopped and said flatly, "Elle, what's wrong?" Not a question, a demand. I told her everything, sitting on the floor of my closet with the door shut, because it was the only room in the house that felt sufficiently far from Nathaniel's office. The restaurant, the overheard call, the spreadsheet with its 3 columns, Desmond, Nora, the Hamptons house. All of it came out in one long, unbroken rush, and by the end of it I was crying for the first time since that first night. Not out of sadness exactly, more out of the sheer physical relief of finally saying it all out loud to someone who wasn't billing me by the hour. Dana was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Okay," she finally said. "First, I'm so sorry. Second, I need you to tell me you're not going to end up in an actual courtroom explaining fraud charges to a judge, because I will drive down there and represent you myself with my 1 semester of pre-law, and it will not go well for either of us." I laughed despite myself, a wet, ragged sound. "Desmond says it's not fraud, it's asset protection. There's a difference, legally." "There'd better be," she said, and then, more gently, "Elle, can I ask you something and you actually answer honestly instead of giving me the CEO version?" "Okay. Does this feel good? What you're doing?" I sat with that question longer than I expected to. "It feels necessary," I said finally. "I don't know if it feels good. Sometimes it feels like the only sane thing left to do. Sometimes, at like 2 in the morning, it feels like I'm turning into someone I don't fully recognize. Someone who lies fluently. Someone who watches her husband's face while he asks a simple question about credit card statements and doesn't even flinch anymore while she lies straight to it." "You're not turning into someone else," Dana said. You're just finding out what you're actually capable of when someone tries to take everything you've built and hand it to a corporate divorce lawyer with a smug haircut. That's oddly specific. I've seen pictures of Miller. He has a smug haircut. I laughed again, a real one this time, and something in my chest loosened a fraction. I keep waiting to feel guilty, I admitted. Like actual, keep you up at night guilt. And it's not there. I feel scared sometimes. I feel tired constantly, but I don't feel guilty. And that scares me almost as much as the plan itself does. What kind of person does what I'm doing and doesn't feel guilty? The kind of person who spent 7 years building something with her own 2 hands while her husband was busy falling back in love with his college girlfriend behind a door he thought was closed. Dana said. No hesitation at all. Elle, you are not stealing from him. You're refusing to hand over what's already yours to a man who is planning to use it to fund a life with someone else, a life he was actively discussing on the phone while you were down the hall doing the dishes. Guilt is for people who did something wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. You just finally stopped being polite about it. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, my back against the closet wall, my knees pulled up to my chest, feeling something settle in me that had been loose and rattling since that first night at the restaurant. Not peace, exactly. I don't think peace was available to me yet, but something adjacent to it. A kind of permission I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for someone else to grant me. I didn't need Dana's permission, strictly speaking. Desmond had already told me, in his careful, lawyerly language, that everything I was doing was defensible. My mother had told me, in her own way, simply by signing every document I put in front of her without a single question, that she trusted whatever I'd decided to do. But there's a difference between being told you're allowed to do something and being told, by someone who loves you and isn't getting paid to say so, that you're not a monster for doing it. I needed that second thing more than I'd realized, and Dana gave it to me without my even having to ask directly. After that call, the guilt I'd been braced for, the one I kept expecting to arrive like a delayed flight, simply never showed up. What replaced the space where it should have been was something colder and considerably more useful. Clarity. I stopped second-guessing every step of the plan and started executing it instead. One document, one transfer, one carefully worded lie at a time, with a steadiness that surprised even me. I think that's the night I actually became the woman who walked out of that house with a suitcase and a navy folder full of paperwork, instead of just the woman who'd started planning it in a fit of shock and rage at 2 a.m. Dana didn't hand me a plan. Desmond had already given me that. What Dana gave me was the belief that I was allowed to use it without spending the rest of my life apologizing for it. Word travels strangely in the fashion world, faster than it has any right to, and never through the channels you'd expect. I don't know exactly how it happened, whether someone at the bank mentioned something to someone at a supplier dinner, or whether Nathaniel himself, in some unguarded moment at a firm happy hour, let slip that his marriage was ending. But by week 7 of everything, a man named Preston Cole, who ran a mid-size fashion conglomerate with a reputation for buying up struggling boutique brands at a fraction of their worth, called my office, directly asking to schedule a meeting. I almost didn't take the call. I had, by that point, roughly 400 more urgent things demanding my attention on any given day. But something about the timing nagged at me enough that I picked up. Elle, it's Preston Cole. I know we've crossed paths a few times at industry events. I wanted to reach out personally, because I understand you might be going through some, let's call it, personal restructuring, and I thought there might be an opportunity for us to talk about Whitman and Company's future. I kept my voice perfectly level. I appreciate the call, Preston. I'm not aware of any restructuring that would be relevant to a conversation like that. Of course. I don't mean to pry into anything private. I just know divorces can get expensive and complicated, especially where a business is concerned. If you found yourself needing liquidity or a partner to help simplify things, My group has done exactly that kind of transaction with several independent brands. We'd be prepared to move quickly and generously, given the circumstances. It took me a moment to fully understand what he was actually offering. He wasn't calling to congratulate me on the Chicago expansion, or to discuss a supplier partnership, or anything resembling a normal business courtesy. He'd heard somewhere that my marriage was collapsing, had presumably assumed that meant my company was vulnerable, distressed, ripe for a lowball acquisition from a woman he pictured as desperate and distracted, and he was calling to pick over the bones before anyone else got there first. "Preston," I said, keeping my tone pleasant, almost warm, the tone you use right before you close a door very firmly. "I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you'll appreciate directness. Whitman and Company isn't struggling. It isn't distressed. It isn't for sale, at any price, generous or otherwise, now or, frankly, ever, as far as I'm concerned. Whatever you've heard about my personal life, I'd ask that you not assume it translates to weakness in my business. That's been a fairly costly assumption for at least one person already this year." There was a pause on the line, and I could practically hear him recalibrating. "I didn't mean any disrespect, Elle. I just know these situations, personally, I mean, can cloud judgment. My judgment is quite clear, actually, possibly clearer than it's been in years." I let that sit for a beat. "I appreciate you thinking of Whitman and Company, Preston. I'll let you know if that ever changes, though I wouldn't hold your breath." I hung up and sat at my desk for a moment, oddly grateful for the call despite myself. It had confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't fully tested yet, that the version of me currently circulating through certain circles of this city, the soon-to-be divorced boutique owner, presumably fragile, presumably distracted, presumably an easy mark, was a story that had nothing to do with the actual woman sitting in this office. People like Preston Cole had built entire careers on the assumption that a woman going through a divorce was a woman who'd stopped paying attention to her own business. I made a point, after that call, of being more visible rather than less. I attended 2 industry events I might otherwise have skipped that month, walked in composed, sharp, entirely unbothered, and let it be known through the ordinary channels of gossip that Whitman and Company was, if anything, expanding, not contracting. I wanted whatever version of my situation was circulating through those rooms to include the detail that I'd walked into a supplier dinner in a sharp navy suit, looking like a woman actively building an empire, not a woman quietly unraveling. Walter noticed the shift too, mentioned it to me one afternoon while we were going over the Chicago lease terms. "You seem different lately. Sharper somehow. I don't mean that as an insult." "I don't take it as one," I told him. "I think I finally stopped trying to protect people's comfortable idea of who I was supposed to be." He didn't ask what I meant by that, and I didn't explain further. But I thought about Preston Cole's call more than I probably should have in the weeks that followed, mostly because it clarified something for me that I hadn't fully articulated even to Desmond. This entire fight was never really about the money, not purely. It was about refusing to let anyone, Nathaniel, Vanessa, some fashion conglomerate circling like it smelled blood in the water, decide for me what my own vulnerability meant, or how much of my life it entitled them to help themselves to. Preston Cole never called back. I heard, months later, secondhand, that he'd made a similar overture to another small brand going through an ugly ownership dispute, and had, in fact, gotten exactly the deal he'd wanted out of a founder too exhausted to fight him off. I thought about that founder sometimes, a woman I'd never met, and felt a fierce, protective kind of anger on her behalf, the same anger that had been fueling every careful, deliberate move I made since the night I first stood in front of my bedroom mirror and watched something in my own eyes catch fire. Nobody was getting a discount off my exhaustion. Not Nathaniel. Not Preston Cole. Not anyone who assumed that a woman fighting for her life had automatically stopped fighting for her business too. I should say something about my mother, because everything I did that year would have been impossible without her, and because I don't think I fully understood, until I was in the middle of asking her to sign away a stake in my company, exactly what kind of woman had raised me. My mother, Margaret, grew up in a walk-up in Astoria with two younger brothers and a father who drank away most of what he earned at the docks. She married young, my own father, a good, quiet man who worked in insurance and died of a heart attack when I was 19, leaving her with a modest pension, a paid-off house in Queens, and a lifetime's worth of practice managing scarcity carefully enough that nobody around her ever felt its edges. She never had the chance to build a career of her own the way I had. Those weren't the options handed to women of her generation in her particular corner of the world, not without a level of family support she never had. But she'd watched every dollar that came through that house with the sharp, patient attention of someone who understood, in her bones, that money wasn't really about the money. It was about never again being the woman whose father drank away the rent. She gave me the money to open my first store not because she had some grand vision for what Whitman and Company would become, but because I'd sat at her kitchen table at 26 years old with a business plan I'd written by hand and a fear in my eyes she recognized from somewhere in her own life, and she decided, quietly, without a single dramatic gesture, that she wasn't going to let me fail from lack of a modest check she could actually afford to write. "I'm not giving you this so you owe me anything," she told me at the time, sliding an envelope across the table like it was nothing more than a birthday card. "I'm giving it to you because I believe you're going to do something with it, and because nobody gave me a chance like this when I was your age, and I'm tired of watching that happen to women in this family." I cried at that kitchen table. I don't think I'd ever fully told her how much that moment meant to me, not directly, not in so many words, until the day I sat across from her again, 7 years later, in Desmond's office, asking her to formalize that gift into a debt, to sign papers claiming a 75% stake in a company that had grown into something worth tens of millions of dollars. I remember feeling almost sick with guilt walking into that meeting, worried I was asking her to participate in something that could expose her, legally or otherwise, to risks she hadn't signed up for when she wrote that first modest check. She listened to Desmond explain the mechanics of the promissory note with the same calm, patient attention she'd once given my hand-drawn business plan. When he finished, she looked at me instead of him. "Is this going to actually protect you, Elle?" "Not partially. Fully." "As much as anything can," I said. "There's some risk. If Nathaniel's lawyer can prove the paperwork was backdated in bad faith, it could go badly. For both of us." She waved that off like it was a mosquito. "I raised you in a house where I watched my own father drink away every dollar that should have gone toward keeping us safe. I am not remotely afraid of a little risk in a lawyer's office, sweetheart. What I'm afraid of is watching you hand half of what you built to a man who spent the last several months of his marriage on the phone with another woman, laughing about how weak you are." Her eyes, sharp, the same sharp eyes I saw in the mirror most mornings, fixed on mine. "Take back what's yours. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign." She did, without a single further question, her handwriting steady across every page Desmond put in front of her. Afterward, over coffee in a diner near his office, she told me something I've thought about often since. "You know, your father used to say the smartest thing I ever did was marry him instead of someone flashier. I used to think that was a compliment about him. Took me years to understand it was actually a compliment about me. I picked well because I paid attention. You married a man who dazzled you at 26, and I understand why. He was charming, and he believed in you at a time you needed someone to. But dazzling and steady aren't the same thing, sweetheart. And it took this whole mess for both of us to see which one he actually was. I didn't have an answer for that at the time. I just held her hand across the table, the same hands that had once counted out grocery money to the dollar in a queen's kitchen, now steady and certain as they signed away 3/4 of a company worth more than either of us had ever imagined possible when she wrote that first small check. She never once, in all the months that followed, asked me for anything in return for what she'd done. When I finally moved into my new penthouse, months after everything was settled, she came over for dinner, walked through the room slowly, running her hand along the counters the way she used to run her hand along the shelves in my very first storefront, and said only, "You did good, Elle. Your father would have been proud of you. I know I am." I think about my mother's hands more than almost anything else from that year. Steady on a pen in a lawyer's office, steady on a grocery list at a kitchen table 30 years earlier. The same steadiness, passed down without either of us ever naming it directly, that let me sit across from Nathaniel at that final dinner and lay out 4 documents without my own hands shaking once. Whatever I built that year, I built with tools she'd handed me decades before I ever needed them. I've never been able to thank her adequately for that, and I suspect she'd tell me, if I tried, that watching me finally use them was thanks enough. I saw her in person exactly once during all of this, and I hadn't planned for it, hadn't braced myself the way I would have if I'd known it was coming. It was a Thursday afternoon, maybe 5 weeks into everything, and I was meeting a fabric supplier for lunch at a small Italian place near my Flatiron store. The kind of unremarkable spot where nobody who mattered in my world would think to look for me. I was early. I was reading through a contract on my phone at a corner table when the door chimed, and a woman walked in who made the back of my neck prickle before my conscious mind had even worked out why. I'd seen photos of her by then. Nathaniel wasn't careful about deleting his search history, and one long, miserable night about a week after the restaurant, I'd gone looking, the way you press on a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. Vanessa Reyes, 34. A former marketing director between jobs, according to her sparse LinkedIn. Pretty in a sharp, deliberate way, the kind of pretty that takes considerable effort and wants credit for looking effortless. She was better looking in person, which somehow made it worse. She came in alone, phone already in hand, and took a table not 10 feet from mine, close enough that I could hear her order a glass of Prosecco in a voice that carried, the kind of voice that had never once worried about being overheard, because it had never occurred to her that anyone listening might have a reason to care. I kept my eyes on my contract. My heart, however, was doing something considerably less composed. She was on the phone within a minute, and though I wasn't trying to listen, the restaurant was small enough that not listening would have required leaving. "No, I told him I'm not doing another 6 months of this," she was saying, irritation sharpening every word. "He keeps saying it's almost done. It's almost done. And meanwhile, I'm still in this apartment with the world's worst water pressure, looking at listings I can't actually afford yet." A pause. I know he's a partner at the firm, but apparently, partner doesn't mean what I thought it meant, because his actual liquid assets are, and I quote, "tied up until the divorce settles," which, again, is taking forever. Another pause, someone on the other end saying something I couldn't hear. "He keeps telling me his wife has millions sitting around from some boutique thing," Vanessa continued, and I nearly choked on my water at the phrase "some boutique thing." 3 storefronts and a company now valued at 8 figures reduced to a shrug in a stranger's mouth. I don't know. Maybe she does. Maybe she doesn't. I've honestly stopped caring about the details as long as the number's real and it shows up eventually. I sat very still, my contract forgotten in my hand, listening to a woman I'd never met discuss my life's work like it was a line item she was owed. My lunch companion arrived a few minutes later, and I forced my way through an hour of conversation about linen weights and delivery timelines that I could not, afterward, remember a single word of. Vanessa left before I did, breezing out with her phone already back to her ear, never once glancing in my direction, never once suspecting that the woman quietly reviewing a contract in the corner was the very boutique thing she was waiting to cash out. I sat alone at my table for a long time after my lunch meeting ended, staring at the door she'd walked through. I thought I'd feel rage. I'd felt plenty of that already, in the weeks since the restaurant, more than enough to fuel every transfer and every carefully worded lie I'd told since. But sitting there, what I actually felt was something closer to pity, cold and distant. The way you might pity someone standing directly beneath a piano that's about to fall. She had no idea, sipping her Prosecco and complaining about water pressure, that the fortune she was waiting on had already quietly relocated itself somewhere she and Nathaniel would never reach. She was planning condos in Soho funded by money that no longer existed in any account either of them could touch. She was, in the most literal sense possible, counting chickens that had already hatched somewhere else entirely, under someone else's name, in an account she would never know the number to. I paid for my lunch, left a generous tip, and walked back to my store with a strange, quiet steadiness settling into my chest. I'd spent 5 weeks feeling like the wronged party in this, which I was, and also, some days, like a woman doing something faintly monstrous in the dark, which some days I also worried I was. But watching Vanessa complain about her water pressure while she waited on money she'd already lost without knowing it, I understood something I hadn't quite let myself understand before. She wasn't a rival I needed to be afraid of. She was simply the reason the mask had finally slipped enough for me to see Nathaniel clearly. She'd get exactly what she'd bargained for in the end. A man with nothing, and a debt he could never pay off fast enough to keep her interested. I never told Nathaniel I'd seen her. There was no version of that conversation that helped me. I just went back to my store, finished the rest of my afternoon, and let the pity curdle quietly into something more useful. Patience. Time seemed to slow down and speed up in strange, uneven bursts over the weeks that followed. And slowly, Nathaniel's smug, untouchable calm began to crack. Vanessa, who had apparently been patient at the start of all this, was growing sharper by the week. The picture of easy luxury Nathaniel had painted for her kept slipping further out of reach, and she was starting to take it out on him. "It's been almost 2 months. When is this actually going to be over?" I heard her demand once, through the thin wall between our bedroom and his office, her voice sharp enough to cut through the drywall. "I'm tired of this apartment. I've been looking at condos in Soho and the prices just keep climbing." "Be patient a little longer, love," Nathaniel said, in the low, soothing tone he probably thought sounded reassuring. "These things take time. Elle said she's pulling together the financial records for a fair split. She's being cooperative." "Cooperative?" Vanessa's laugh came through the wall, brittle and unkind. "Or is she hiding everything from you? You're too soft, Nathaniel. You need to actually check her accounts, her investments. For all you know, she's already moved everything and you're about to start from zero." Being called soft cut. Nathaniel somewhere deep, somewhere his ego lived. Driven by the doubt Vanessa had planted, he decided quietly to start looking into things himself. He didn't want to seem rattled in front of me, so he moved in secret. One evening, while I was in the shower, he went into my office, powered on my laptop, and guessed my login pin correctly on the first try, our wedding date. Because of course it was. He tried logging into one of our joint brokerage accounts he hadn't checked in years, typing in the username and password he remembered from some long-forgotten afternoon. Error. He tried again. Nothing. Incorrect username or password. He clicked the reset link, hoping the confirmation would land in his own inbox, but the system informed him the recovery email had gone to the primary account holder's address. As far as he knew, that was my personal email. A bad feeling started to settle over him. The next day, he called the brokerage's customer service line. After a lengthy identity check, he finally got a representative on the phone. "I can't get into my account," he said, reading off the account number. "Can you check what's going on?" "One moment, sir." A pause. "According to our records, the password on this account was changed 2 weeks ago by the primary account holder, L. Whitman." His heart kicked up a notch. "Changed? Why would it be changed?" "We don't have information on the reason, sir. As the secondary holder, you don't have the authority to change account details or reset the password yourself. You'll need to reach out to the primary holder directly." He hung up in a fury. That evening, he worked up the nerve to bring it to me directly, trying his best to sound casual, like it had just occurred to him in passing. "L, I tried to log into our brokerage account the other day and couldn't. Looks like the password changed." I was on the sofa with a book. I looked up, my expression carefully arranged into something calm and slightly puzzled, with not a shred of the alarm actually racing through me. "Oh, that," I said, dry, unbothered. "My financial advisor handled that. Ahead of dividing everything up, we decided it made sense for her to have temporary full access, so neither of us could make unilateral trades before a court decision. She said it's standard to protect the assets and make sure everything stays fair and transparent." Fair, transparent, protect. I'd handed his own words right back to him, the very language he'd used on me the night he asked for a divorce, wrapped now in a story that sounded professional, sensible, even like it served his interests too. His suspicion softened, just slightly, but it didn't vanish completely. "A financial advisor? Since when do you have one of those?" "Since you asked me for a divorce," I said, my eyes returning to my book. "I don't know divorce law. I don't know the ins and outs of the market the way you think you do. I needed someone qualified in my corner so I wouldn't make a mistake that hurt either of us." That answer quieted him for the moment. The idea of his supposedly fragile, clueless wife hiring professional help sounded reasonable enough on its face, but the seed of doubt had already taken root, and it kept growing. He started noticing small things after that. I ended phone calls quickly whenever he walked into a room. I stopped leaving my laptop open on the kitchen counter. I was leaving the house more often, always with some perfectly plausible reason: a supplier meeting, a boutique check-in. But when I came home, my face had changed. It wasn't sad and defeated anymore. It looked focused, purposeful. One night he woke up to find my side of the bed empty. He searched the house and found me sitting alone on the balcony, staring out into the dark, not crying, just sitting there with my spine straight and something strange radiating off me, something that unsettled him a little, though he couldn't have named what. "You're still up?" he asked. I turned my head. My eyes were clear in the glow of the garden lights. "Just needed some air. Got a lot on my mind." He went back to bed alone. His unease only deepened. Vanessa's complaints kept echoing in his ear, tangled up with the image of a wife who was becoming harder and harder to read. For the first time, some small part of him started to suspect that his flawless plan might have a crack running through it somewhere, and the name of that crack was mine. He tried to shake the feeling off, telling himself everything was still going exactly according to plan. But somewhere underneath, he already knew the calm was over, and something darker was gathering on the horizon, though he still had no idea how close it already was. I noticed the car before I understood what it meant. A gray sedan, nondescript, the kind of vehicle that seems specifically engineered to be forgotten the moment you look away from it, parked across the street from my Flatiron store for 3 afternoons in a row. I might not have registered it at all if I hadn't happened to glance out the front window at the exact same time each day, a little after 4, and seen the same silhouette behind the wheel, a man who never got out, never seemed to be waiting for anyone, just sat there with a coffee cup and, I eventually noticed, a camera with a long lens resting on the passenger seat. I mentioned it to Walter almost as an afterthought, The kind of comment you make about something odd without yet believing it's actually a threat. Walter, to his credit, didn't dismiss it. He wrote down the plate number the next afternoon, pretending to check the parking meter outside, and ran it by a contact of his who did some occasional security consulting for the boutiques. The car was registered to a private investigation firm 2 boroughs over. I called Desmond within the hour, my hands not quite steady on the phone. "I think Nathaniel hired someone to follow me." Desmond, to his credit, didn't sound remotely surprised. "I've been expecting this for a couple of weeks, honestly. Vanessa's been pushing him to verify things independently instead of just taking your word for it. A PI makes sense as his next move. It's actually a good sign, in a strange way." A good sign? It means he still doesn't have anything concrete. If he had proof of the transfers, he'd already be filing an emergency motion, not paying someone to sit in a parked car outside your storefront. He's fishing. That tells us he's scared and grasping, not that he's found something. Small comfort, but I took it. Still, the next few weeks took on a different texture entirely. I found myself checking mirrors I'd never bothered checking before, taking a longer route home some evenings just to see if the gray sedan, or anything like it, appeared behind me. Desmond had me switch the location of our meetings twice, moving from the daily grind to a rotating handful of coffee shops, and, once, a bookstore cafe in Brooklyn that felt almost comically far from anywhere either of us actually had business being. The closest call came on a Tuesday, about 10 days after Walter first spotted the car. I'd arranged to meet Nora at a small branch of my new bank to sign the last of the paperwork on an account restructuring, something that needed to happen in person, no way around it. I'd taken every precaution I could think of, a different entrance than usual, a scarf and sunglasses that felt faintly ridiculous, but that Desmond had insisted on, and a route that looped through 2 other errands first so there'd be nothing unusual on record if anyone ever pulled security footage looking for a pattern. I was walking out of the bank, paperwork tucked into my bag, when a man fell into step a few feet behind me on the sidewalk. Not obviously following, not doing anything a stranger couldn't do on any city block in the world, but close enough, consistent enough in his pace, that some old animal part of my brain went on immediate alert. I didn't run. Running would have told him everything he needed to know. Instead, I did what Desmond had coached me to do exactly for this scenario. I walked 2 blocks in the wrong direction from where I actually needed to go, stopped at a newsstand to buy a pack of gum I didn't want, and used the reflection in the glass case to get a look at him without turning around. Middle-aged, unremarkable, a camera bag slung low across his body in a way that tried and failed to look casual. When I started walking again, he kept pace, half a block back. My heart was slamming against my ribs by the time I ducked into a crowded coffee shop, the kind with 2 exits, one onto the street I'd come from and one onto the side street behind it. I ordered a coffee. I had no intention of drinking, waited 4 minutes by the clock on the wall, and slipped out the back exit while he was presumably still watching the front door. I called Desmond from a cab 20 minutes later, my voice not quite steady. He followed me from the bank. "Did he get anything? Photos? Anything you saw?" "I don't think so. I lost him in a coffee shop on 19th. There was a pause, and then, to my surprise, something that sounded almost like amusement in Desmond's voice. "You lost a tail in a coffee shop. Ms. Whitman, I have to say, you're taking to this considerably better than most of my clients do. I don't feel like I'm taking to it well. I feel like I'm going to throw up." That's a normal reaction to a genuinely stressful situation. It doesn't mean you're handling it badly. It means you're a person with a working nervous system. He paused. For what it's worth, even if he had gotten a photo of you walking out of a bank, it wouldn't prove anything on its own. You're allowed to have a bank account, Ms. Whitman. What he needs is documentation of the transfers themselves, account numbers, statements. And that information isn't sitting in a folder anyone can photograph from a sidewalk. He was right, And I knew he was right. And it still took me 2 full days before my hand stopped feeling faintly unsteady every time I left my own store. The investigator, whoever he was, apparently struck out entirely. Whatever Nathaniel was paying him for, all he ever seemed to manage was confirming that I went to work, went to meetings, occasionally visited a bank branch, activities so mundane they told him nothing at all. Walter spotted the gray sedan 2 more times over the following weeks, and then, abruptly, never again. I found out much later from the same rambling voicemail that told me everything else that Nathaniel had eventually stopped paying the retainer after Vanessa accused him, in one of their increasingly frequent arguments, of wasting money on a man who apparently couldn't find anything more incriminating than a woman running errands. I never found out the investigator's name, and I never especially wanted to. But I've thought since about how close that whole plan came to unraveling over something as small as a gray sedan and a man with a long lens who happened to be moderately competent at his job. If he'd caught me on a day when the paperwork in my bag had actually mattered, if he'd followed me on a day I hadn't taken the long way with 2 extra stops, the whole architecture I'd spent weeks building might have come apart in an afternoon. It didn't. But I stopped assuming, after that I had the upper hand simply because I was smarter than Nathaniel. I had the upper hand because I was more careful than Nathaniel, which is a different thing entirely, and a much more fragile one. Careful has to be maintained every single day. Smart, you can coast on. I didn't coast on anything again for the rest of that year. Everything seemed to accelerate after that. Nathaniel was talking to his own lawyer more and more, no doubt hammering out the final paperwork he thought would finish me off cleanly. I knew I had only a handful of days left, maybe a week at the outside, before that petition landed officially in a courthouse, and every marital asset got frozen in place by law. There was one thing left to finish: the joint checking account, the family's day-to-day wallet, the last remaining symbol, on paper anyway, of a financial life we supposedly still shared. Compared to the tens of millions I'd already secured, the balance sitting there was almost laughably small. But taking that money had a different kind of weight to it. It meant severing the very last thread connecting me to him, erasing the last dollar of a life that was already, in every way that mattered, over. I waited until well past midnight. Nathaniel's soft, even breathing from the bedroom was my signal. I slipped into the office and powered on the computer, a familiar tightness settling into my chest. This would likely be the last time I ever needed to do this in secret. I opened the banking portal. The balance sat around $35,000, mostly last month's salaries, plus a scattering of smaller deposits. I could have taken all of it. The temptation was there, quiet but insistent, a voice whispering that zeroing him out would only be fair payback for everything he'd tried to do to me. I shook my head and pushed the thought away. This was never about blind revenge. It was about precision. My win had to be clean, defensible, untouchable. I opened the transaction history and did the math carefully. Nathaniel's salary for the month came to roughly $30,000. The rest, about $5,000, I couldn't directly trace back to my own earnings, so I left it where it was. I transferred just that $5,000 into my new account. The transaction cleared in seconds. When it was done, I looked at the remaining $30,000 still sitting there. Enough to cover him for a month, maybe 2. This wasn't generosity. It was strategy. Leaving that much behind meant he could never credibly accuse me of theft, of trying to leave him with nothing. It proved, in black and white, that I wasn't driven by greed, just by clarity. I closed the laptop, hit by a wave of relief so heavy it nearly buckled my knees, tangled up with an unexpected grief I hadn't braced for. That door was closed now, permanently. No more shared finances, no more hours. Just his and mine. My quiet war was finished. All that was left now was to actually say so out loud. The next day, I began preparing for the end. I didn't pack up my whole life. That would have looked like panic, and panic would have raised questions I couldn't afford. Instead, I packed one medium suitcase, my favorite clothes, a few things that actually mattered to me, my laptop, and, most important of all, a navy blue folder. That folder was my entire arsenal. Bank statements from my new account showing an obscene, undeniable balance. The notarized sale agreement for the Hamptons house. The paperwork proving my mother now held 75% of Whitman and Company. And a short summary from Desmond confirming, in plain legal language, that every single thing I'd done was airtight. Every page in that folder was a bullet loaded and ready. For 2 days, I kept up my normal routine, calm on the surface, coiled tight underneath. Every time I heard Nathaniel's car in the driveway, my heart sped up, wondering if this would be the night. It was Friday when it finally happened. Nathaniel walked in with a lighter step than I'd seen in weeks, a smug little smile playing at his mouth, an expensive-looking brown leather briefcase in his hand. "We're not eating in tonight," he said, in a tone so cheerfully fake it almost hurt to listen to. "I want to show you something. Call it a celebration, the start of our separate new lives." I looked at the briefcase, then at him, and nodded slowly. "We don't need to go anywhere," I said, my voice calm on the surface, a storm churning underneath it. "Let's just talk here." This was it. The final scene. And I was more than ready for it. We sat down across from each other at the same oak table where he'd first told me our marriage was over. But the air between us was completely different this time. Nathaniel radiated the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. I felt something ice-cold and perfectly still settle over me instead. He set the brown leather briefcase on the table with a small theatrical flourish. "Ready, Elle?" His tone was condescending, the same tone you'd use with a child who needed something explained slowly. "My lawyer's excellent. Everything's in here. The divorce agreement, the list of marital assets split 50-50, all of it. We just need to sign in front of a notary tomorrow and file with the court. Quick, clean, no drama." He slid the briefcase toward me. "Read it yourself. It's all there. This house, the beach house, the savings, half the value of your company. We're splitting everything fairly." I didn't touch it. I let it sit there between us, a small monument to everything he thought he was entitled to. Instead, I reached for the navy folder resting on the chair beside me and set it down with the same unhurried calm. "I brought some paperwork for you too," I said, my voice even and clear. He laughed, a short, contemptuous little sound. "What paperwork? A letter from your advisor?" "Not necessary, Elle. This isn't emotional. It's purely legal." I ignored that and opened the folder, sliding out the first sheet. A printout from the joint account, dated that very morning. "Here's our joint account," I said, pushing it across the table. $30,000, 15 for you, 15 for me. Fair, right? His smile disappeared. "What are you talking about? Our savings are in the millions." I slid out the second sheet. My new account statement. A long, undeniable row of numbers at the bottom. "These are my savings. Not ours. My salary, my company bonuses, my investment returns. All of it's already been moved here." His eyes went wide. You can't do that." "I can," I said, pulling out the third sheet. "The sale agreement for the Hamptons house. And as for the beach house, you're a little late. That was never a personal asset, it was corporate property. As CEO of Whitman and Company, I made the call to sell it last month to shore up company reserves. Here's the agreement." He snatched it out of my hand, scanning the names. Whitman and Company as seller. Harbor Point Holdings, LLC, a name he'd never heard, as buyer. His hands started to tremble. This is impossible. I never consented to this. You didn't need to, I said. It was a corporate transaction. And the proceeds went straight into the LLC's account, which, of course, isn't marital property. He was breathing hard now, his face flushing red with something halfway between rage and a fear that was just starting to creep in. The company. At the very least, I have a claim to half of your company. We built that together, didn't we? I raised an eyebrow and pulled out the last document, the one I'd been saving. According to this, notarized, filed, entirely legal, I'm only a minority shareholder in my own company. 75% of Whitman and Company belongs to my mother now, repayment for the capital I borrowed when I was starting out. A debt that just happened to come due right around the time you started mentioning the word divorce. Funny how that worked out. He stared at the paper, at my mother's name printed clearly as majority owner. His legs seemed to give out slightly under him. Every plan he'd built, the new place with Vanessa, the luxury life he'd promised her, all of it collapsed in front of him in under 5 minutes. This is fraud, he shouted, slamming his fist against the table hard enough to rattle the plates. This is illegal. You stole from me. I'll sue you. I'll destroy you. For the first time all night I smiled. Not warm, cold, and full of something close to triumph. I stood up from my chair. Go ahead and sue me. My lawyer would love to see you in court. But before you do that, ask your own attorney something first. Ask him if it's illegal for a wife to manage assets legally registered in her own name. Ask him if it's illegal to sell property your own company owns. Ask him if it's illegal to repay a debt. I let the words settle. You called me weak. You were wrong about that. My only real weakness was letting you underestimate me for as long as I did. Believing, for way too long, that the man sleeping next to me actually wanted good things for me. Well, I've taken back what's mine now. I walked toward the front door where my suitcase was already waiting. Build your new palace with Vanessa. Just know you'll be laying the first stone yourself. I picked up the handle of my suitcase. Goodbye, Nathaniel. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air without looking back once. The door clicked shut behind me. Quiet. Final. Like the sound of a gavel coming down. A sound announcing that the trial was over, and the verdict had already been decided long before he ever knew there was a case against him. I checked into a hotel a few blocks from my Flatiron store that night. A small, unremarkable place I'd chosen weeks earlier and never told anyone about. Not even Dana, in case Nathaniel came looking before I was ready to be found. The room was plain, beige, forgettable in every way, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after the door clicked shut behind me, still holding the handle of my suitcase like I hadn't quite processed that I could put it down now. My phone had already started buzzing before I'd even made it to the elevator downstairs at the house. I'd felt it in my coat pocket, insistent, and I hadn't looked at it once. Not in the cab, not in the hotel lobby, not until I was sitting alone in that beige room with the door locked and the chain drawn across it. An extra precaution that felt faintly absurd and entirely necessary at the same time. I finally looked. 4 messages already, each one a little more frantic than the last, though I didn't read past the first line of any of them that night. I wasn't ready. I turned the phone face down on the nightstand, the same gesture Nathaniel had once used on me. The coffee table, months earlier, right before he told me our marriage was over, and something about the symmetry of it made me laugh, a short, slightly unhinged sound in an empty hotel room. I called Dana first. She picked up on the first ring, like she'd been sitting with her phone in her hand all evening waiting. It's done, I said, before she could even ask. I told him everything. I left. Oh, thank God, she breathed out, and I could hear her moving, probably sitting down somewhere, probably pressing a hand to her chest the way she did when she was overwhelmed. "How do you feel?" I sat with that question for a long moment, staring at the ugly hotel curtains, trying to find an honest answer instead of a tidy one. "Empty," I finally said. Not sad exactly, not triumphant either, not the way I thought I'd feel. Just hollowed out. Like I've been holding my breath for 2 months, and I finally exhaled, and now I don't know what to do with all this extra room in my chest. "That's allowed," Dana said gently. "You don't have to feel triumphant tonight. Tonight you're allowed to just feel however you actually feel." We talked for almost an hour, about nothing in particular toward the end. Her kids, a movie she'd half-watched that week, small, ordinary things that had nothing to do with divorce lawyers or promissory notes, and I was grateful for every mundane minute of it. By the time we hung up, something in my chest had loosened slightly, enough that I finally felt tired instead of just wired. I called my mother next briefly, mostly to tell her it was over and that I was safe, and she said in her steady, unhurried way, "Get some sleep, Elle. Everything else can wait until morning. You did the hard part already." I didn't sleep much anyway. I lay in that unfamiliar bed staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine, listening to the muffled sounds of the city through a window that didn't open properly, and let myself, finally, actually feel the size of what had just happened. Not the strategy of it, which I'd been running like a spreadsheet for 2 months, the actual, human size of it. 7 years of my life, ending in a single evening at an oak table, over documents I'd prepared myself, delivered in a voice I'd practiced keeping steady. I cried eventually, somewhere around 1 in the morning, not the sharp, immediate grief of that first night after the restaurant, but something slower and more complicated. Grief for the marriage I'd actually wanted, the one I thought I'd had for the first 5 years, before Vanessa's name resurfaced and pulled the floor out from under everything. Grief for the version of myself who'd once believed, completely, that the man helping her hang inventory on a Saturday afternoon was building something with her, instead of merely biding his time until something better came along. I let myself cry for a while, because I'd earned that much, at least, after 2 months of not allowing myself a single visible crack in the performance. And then, somewhere around 2, the same hour I'd once stood in front of my bedroom mirror and watched something cold and clear catch fire in my own eyes, I stopped. I picked my phone up off the nightstand, finally, and read through the messages I'd been ignoring all night. Anger, threats, a pathetic late attempt at negotiation. I read every one of them slowly without responding and felt something settle into place inside me with each one, a confirmation, in his own words, of exactly why none of this had been unreasonable. Then I opened my settings and blocked his number, calmly, deliberately, the way you close a door you never intend to open again. I set the phone down, turned off the lamp, and finally, somewhere close to 3 in the morning, fell asleep in that plain, forgettable hotel room, my suitcase still packed at the foot of the bed, everything I actually needed already inside it. I woke up the next morning to sunlight coming through curtains that didn't quite close all the way, and for one disoriented moment I forgot where I was, forgot that anything had changed. Then it came back to me, all at once, the whole weight and the whole relief of it together, and I lay there for a long moment simply breathing, feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely unafraid of what the day in front of me actually held. I wasn't in the house for what happened next, but I've pieced enough of it together since, from Walter, from a mutual friend who still talked to Nathaniel out of some misplaced sense of loyalty, and eventually, months later, from a long, rambling voicemail Nathaniel himself left on my phone that I listened to exactly once and never called back about. I know it well enough now that it plays behind my eyes like something I actually witnessed. He sat there for a long while after the door clicked shut, just staring at the two things left on the table. His own briefcase, brown leather, suddenly useless, and my navy folder, which had, in the space of about 10 minutes, become the tombstone of every plan he'd made. The reality of it hit him like a truck. This wasn't a bad dream he could wake up from. It was simply, permanently, real. His first instinct was denial, tangled up with panic. He grabbed his phone, hands shaking so badly he could barely get the call to connect. "Miller!" he shouted the second the line picked up, skipping every formality. "My wife robbed me. She moved all the money, sold the beach house, signed the company over to her mother. This is fraud. We need to sue her. We need to freeze everything right now." On the other end, his lawyer let out a long, tired sigh. "Slow down, Nathaniel. Walk me through this from the beginning. When exactly did these transfers happen?" "I don't know. Sometime over the last few weeks." "And the divorce petition? Has it actually been filed with the court clerk yet?" "No. I was planning to file the papers tomorrow." A long silence stretched out on the line. Nathaniel could feel something heavy settling into the air, though he still didn't have a name for it. "Nathaniel." His lawyer's voice had gone flat. "I have to tell you something you're not going to want to hear. If all of these transactions happened before our petition was officially registered with the court, and if the assets in question were legally titled in your wife's name or her company's name, then what she did is, almost certainly, completely legal." "Legal?" Nathaniel's voice cracked. "It's theft. It's called proactive asset management. Until there's a court order or an injunction in place, she was free to do whatever she wanted with property that legally belonged to her. You should have filed the second you decided you wanted this divorce. You gave her far too much time." A pause. "Legally speaking, she didn't rob you, Nathaniel. She just outplayed you." The phone slipped out of his hand and hit the floor. Outplayed. The word looped in his head on repeat. The woman he'd spent months quietly calling weak, obsessed, easy to manage, had run circles around him without him ever noticing the ground shifting under his feet. His next thought was Vanessa. He had to tell her. Hands still trembling, he called her. "Hey, love, so what's the news? When are we signing?" Her voice was bright, hopeful, already halfway into a life she hadn't earned yet. "Vanessa." His voice came out hoarse. "There's a problem. The money. The house. Elle took everything. It's gone." Silence on the line. Not shock. Something colder than that. "What do you mean, gone?" Her voice dropped several octaves. "She transferred everything. Sold the house. The company's in her mother's name now. There's barely anything left in the household account, and this place still has a huge mortgage on it," he said, the words tumbling out. A sharp, cruel laugh came through the phone. "Gone? You let her take everything? Are you actually this stupid? I gave up my whole life for the promises you made me, and now you're telling me it's gone? I didn't think she'd do this. I thought she was—" "You thought she was stupid." Vanessa cut him off. "Turns out the fool in this whole thing was you. I'm not living in poverty, and I'm definitely not starting over with a loser. Don't call me again." The call ended. Just like that. Click. The great love he'd used as his justification for burning his entire life down turned out to be love for a bank balance, and nothing else. Now he really was alone. Truly, completely alone. Panic gave way to something worse. Desperation. He needed to reach me. He needed to beg. The first message he sent me was furious. "You'll regret this. I won't let you get away with it." I didn't answer. The second one carried threats. "I'll tell everyone what a manipulative snake you are. I'll ruin your reputation and your business." Still nothing from me. The third one softened. An attempt at negotiation. "Okay. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Let's just talk. Don't do this. I'll give you whatever you want. No response. Finally, whatever mask of arrogance he had left cracked entirely, and it collapsed into something pathetic. Elle, please don't leave me like this. I have nothing. I'm so sorry. Please answer me. I never did. He waited an hour, eyes glued to the screen, hoping for any flicker of a response. When he tried sending one more message, it failed to deliver. He tried calling. No ring. Just dead air. I had blocked his number. That, apparently, was the moment that finally broke him. Not the screaming, not the threats. My complete silence. It told him, more clearly than any words could have, that he wasn't worth a response anymore. He sat alone in the dark of that house, surrounded by expensive furniture and memories that had gone hollow overnight. The wreckage of his own greed scattered across a table built for two people who no longer had anything left to say to each other. I'd like to say that walking out with my suitcase was the end of it, that the door closing behind me was the final scene in every sense, not just the theatrical one. It wasn't. What followed was 6 more months of a considerably less dramatic, but no less exhausting war, fought almost entirely through filings, depositions, and a rotating cast of increasingly frustrated attorneys on Nathaniel's side. He filed his petition 4 days after I left, through Miller, the same lawyer who delivered the news over the phone that I'd apparently outplayed him rather than robbed him. The initial filing was almost comically aggressive, framing every transfer I'd made as a calculated fraud designed specifically to defraud a spouse of marital assets, using language that made me sound, if I'm honest, considerably more villainous than I felt most days. Desmond forwarded it to me with a single line in the email. This is what fear looks like when it has a law degree. Don't worry about it yet. The first deposition happened about 6 weeks in a conference room on the 14th floor of Desmond's building, the kind of room with a view specifically designed to remind everyone inside it how much an hour of anyone's time there actually cost. I sat across a long table from Nathaniel for the first time since the night I'd walked out, and I'll admit some small, petty part of me had wondered how I'd feel, seeing him again after everything. What I felt, mostly, was tired. He looked thinner than I remembered, and his suit, a good one, expensive, hung on him slightly wrong, like he'd lost weight the stress had eaten off him rather than the gym had earned for him. His eyes had a hollowed, sleepless quality I recognized because I'd been wearing the same look myself, months earlier, before I'd learned to sleep again. Miller led with the accusation that mattered most, the one that could have actually hurt me if it stuck. Ms. Whitman, isn't it true that you began transferring marital assets specifically in anticipation of a divorce, with the deliberate intent to deprive your husband of his rightful share? Desmond had prepped me extensively for this exact question, and I answered it exactly the way we'd practiced. Calm, unhurried, betraying nothing. I began managing my personal and business assets, all of which were legally titled solely in my name or my company's name, using my own judgment, as any business owner would, I said. At no point did I transfer, sell, or restructure anything that was legally shared marital property. Every transaction is documented and dated, and every one of them occurred before any petition was filed with the court. You expect this court to believe the timing was coincidental? That you happened to liquidate tens of millions of dollars in assets in the exact week surrounding your husband asking for a divorce? I expect the court to look at the dates on the documents, I said. I'm not required to explain my timing. I'm required to have acted legally, and I did. Miller pushed harder on the company restructuring, the promissory note, my mother's sudden 75% stake. This was, everyone in that room understood, the weakest point in my armor, the one piece of the plan that relied on a story instead of simple, unambiguous ownership. This loan agreement between you and your mother is dated 7 years ago, Miller said, sliding a copy of the note across the table like he'd already won something. Yet it was never disclosed on any tax filing, any business document, any conversation your husband was ever party to in 7 years of marriage. Isn't it more likely this document was created recently, specifically to defeat his claim? Desmond answered before I had to. My client isn't required to have disclosed a private family loan to her husband, Mr. Miller, any more than your client was required to disclose the details of his relationship with Ms. Reyes over the course of this marriage. If you'd like to depose Ms. Whitman's mother regarding the terms of the loan and the original bank transfer that funded it, we're happy to arrange that. I'd remind you the burden here is on your client to prove fraud, not on mine to prove innocence. My mother's deposition happened 2 weeks later and I sat in on it, mostly for moral support, though she needed considerably less of it than I expected. She answered every question Miller asked with the same calm, faintly amused patience she'd had signing the original papers in Desmond's office. Mrs. Whitman, can you describe the original terms of this loan to your daughter 7 years ago? I gave her money to open her first store, my mother said simply. I told her to pay me back when she could, and if she couldn't, we'd figure something out as a family. That's what the paperwork reflects. Was there ever a written agreement at the time? Not on paper, no. My daughter and I don't require paperwork to trust each other, Mr. Miller. Apparently that's an unusual arrangement in some families. Miller tried a different angle. Isn't it convenient that this informal understanding suddenly became a formal, notarized document with a 75% equity conversion right around the time your daughter's marriage was ending? My mother looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression made the young court reporter in the corner of the room glance up from her stenography machine. My daughter built a company from a single rented storefront that used to be a dry cleaner, my mother said. She did that with very little help from anyone, including, apparently, her own husband, who seems to have spent the last several years of that marriage a great deal more interested in a woman from his past than in his wife's business. I don't find it convenient that I formalized a debt my daughter has always intended to honor. I find it convenient that I was in a position to help her protect what she built, right when she needed it most. Some of us take care of our children, Mr. Miller. I understand that's apparently unusual in this room, too. Desmond told me afterward, once we were alone in the elevator, that it was one of the cleanest depositions he'd witnessed in 15 years of practice. My mother had, without raising her voice once, made Nathaniel's entire fraud theory sound not just legally weak, but faintly ridiculous, the kind of accusation only a man embarrassed by his own miscalculation would bother making. The mediation sessions that followed were, if anything, worse for Nathaniel than the depositions had been, because mediation required him to sit across a table from me for hours at a time, without the theater of a formal deposition to hide behind. He tried early on to appeal to whatever he assumed was left of my affection for him, a strategy Desmond had warned me to expect and had coached me carefully not to engage with. We don't have to do this the hard way, he said, during a break in the second session, his voice pitched low, private, like we were still the kind of people who talked to each other privately about anything. 7 years has to count for something. We could work this out between us, without all these lawyers running up the bill on both sides. We tried working things out between us, I said. You handled that conversation from behind a closed office door, on the phone with someone else, calling me weak. I'm comfortable letting the lawyers handle it from here. He didn't try that particular approach again. By the fourth mediation session, it had become clear to everyone in the room, including, eventually, Miller himself, that there was simply nothing left to litigate. The assets in question were documented, dated, and defensible, every one of them. The company restructuring held up under every angle of scrutiny Miller could find, largely because my mother genuinely had lent me that money 7 years earlier, whatever the timing of the formal paperwork, and a jury or judge examining the original bank transfer would have no trouble believing her account of it. The house sale to Harbor Point Holdings was, on paper, indistinguishable from any ordinary corporate real estate transaction, priced fairly, executed properly, notarized correctly. The final settlement, when it came, gave Nathaniel almost exactly what I'd already decided, months earlier, sitting at my laptop with that 3-column spreadsheet, that he deserved. Half of what remained in the joint checking account by the time all the dust settled, a modest amount that had never been the point of any of this. Full responsibility for the mortgage on the house, which meant, in practice, that he had to sell it within the year, once he couldn't carry the payments alone on an associate's salary that no longer had my income quietly propping it up. Desmond called me the afternoon the final papers were signed, his voice carrying an unusual note of genuine satisfaction. "It's done, Ms. Whitman. Officially, legally, completely done. For what it's worth, in 15 years of doing this, I don't think I've ever seen a client walk into my office with less time to plan and walk out with a cleaner result." "I had a lot of motivation," I said. "Most people do. Motivation isn't usually enough on its own. You were also, if I can say so, remarkably good at this. Better than plenty of people who do it for a living." I thought about that comment for a long time after we hung up, sitting alone in my new apartment with the paperwork spread across the kitchen table. The same way I'd once spread it across my home office desk in a house that no longer belonged to either of us. Remarkably good at this. It wasn't a compliment I'd ever imagined wanting, back when my only ambition had been building a good business and a good marriage in roughly equal measure. But I'd take it. I'd earned it. Every long night, and every steady lie, and every careful, patient step of it. And I understood, sitting there, that whatever skill I'd discovered in myself over those 6 harrowing months wasn't something I'd invented out of nowhere. It had been there all along, the same instinct that had built 3 boutiques out of a single storefront that smelled like dry cleaning solvent. The same instinct for finding the crack in a bad situation and turning it into an opening. I'd just never had to point it at my own marriage before. I hoped, closing that folder for the last time, that I never would again. While the lawyers argued over documents in conference rooms with expensive views, I was busy doing something that felt, in its own quiet way, considerably more important. I was building an actual life to walk into once all the paperwork finally settled. I found the apartment about 6 weeks after that first night in the hotel. A 2-bedroom on the 22nd floor of a building on the west side, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water, more space than I strictly needed and exactly the amount of space I wanted anyway. I remember standing in the empty living room the day I first toured it, sunlight pouring across bare hardwood floors, and feeling something unlock in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel over an empty apartment. Possibility, maybe, or just the particular relief of imagining a home that had no history in it yet, nothing that had happened to me already living in its walls. I furnished it slowly, deliberately, over the following months, refusing to rush any of it the way I might have if I'd been trying to erase the old house as fast as possible. I wanted to choose every piece on purpose: a research trip to a furniture maker upstate for the dining table, an afternoon spent in 3 different showrooms before I found a sofa that actually felt like mine instead of like a compromise. Dana teased me about it constantly, told me I was treating apartment furnishing like a corporate acquisition, doing due diligence on throw pillows. She wasn't entirely wrong. I think I needed the deliberateness of it, needed to prove to myself piece by piece that I was capable of building something slowly and carefully instead of only ever reacting to a crisis. The last several months had asked everything of my instincts for speed, for secrecy, for moving fast before someone noticed. Choosing a rug took me 3 weeks, and I loved every unhurried minute of it. I threw myself back into the boutiques too, more fully than I had in years, if I'm honest, since a good portion of my attention over the previous half-decade of marriage had been quietly split between the business and whatever emotional labor it took to maintain a marriage that was, in retrospect, already eroding out from under me. Freed of that particular tax on my attention, I found I had more of myself available for Whitman and Company than I'd realized I'd been missing. The Chicago expansion, which had been a distant someday idea before all of this started, became something I threw myself into with an intensity that surprised even Walter. I flew out twice that fall to scout locations myself, walked entire neighborhoods on foot for hours at a time, sat in coffee shops watching foot traffic patterns like it was the most fascinating data in the world, because, that season, it genuinely was to me. It was clean. It had no history attached to it. Nobody in Chicago knew or cared that I'd spent the previous summer secretly liquidating a marriage's worth of assets while pretending to grieve calmly over breakfast. I started running again, too. Something I'd let slide for years, mornings along the water before work, and found that the physical rhythm of it, the specific quiet of a body doing something simple and repetitive, gave my mind somewhere to actually process everything that had happened instead of just managing it. I did some of my clearest thinking that year on those morning runs, working out, half-consciously, exactly what kind of woman I wanted to be on the other side of all of it. I went to therapy too, which surprised me a little, since I'd always assumed, in some vague way, that therapy was for people whose problems were more ordinary than mine, more manageable, less tangled up in legal strategy and secret bank accounts. My therapist, a calm, unflappable woman named Dr. Osei, never once made me feel like the strategic parts of what I'd done needed defending in her office. She was interested instead in the quieter question underneath it: why I'd stayed so long inside a marriage that had clearly stopped serving me years before Vanessa's name ever resurfaced, what it had cost me to keep believing for so long that the silence between Nathaniel and me was a phase instead of a verdict. You spent 7 years being genuinely excellent at reading contracts, markets, supplier behavior, everything except the actual state of your own marriage, she said to me once, a comment that landed with more force than I expected. I wonder what it would look like for you to apply that same clarity to your own life going forward, instead of only to your business. I've carried that question with me since, turning it over on those morning runs, in the quiet of my new apartment, in the middle of Chicago showroom walkthroughs. I don't think I have a complete answer yet, but I know I look at things differently now. Relationships, opportunities, the small, easy-to-miss signals that tell you whether someone actually sees you or is simply comfortable with the convenient idea of you. I don't ignore those signals anymore, the way I once ignored years of Nathaniel's slow, quiet withdrawal because acknowledging it felt scarier than pretending it was temporary. Dana worried, at one point that fall, that I was throwing myself into work and renovation and running as a way of avoiding the actual grief underneath it all, and she wasn't entirely wrong to worry. I did grieve, eventually, properly, mostly in Dr. Osei's office, mostly on those long morning runs where nobody could see my face. But I also think there's a version of healing that looks like building something new with your bare hands, one deliberate choice at a time, and I don't think that version is any less real just because it happens to look, from the outside, like ambition instead of recovery. By the time the final settlement papers were signed, 6 months after that first night in the hotel, I had an apartment that felt entirely mine, a company on the verge of its biggest expansion yet, a therapist who'd helped me untangle years of quiet self-deception, and a body that could run 6 miles along the water without stopping to think about anything except the next step in front of it. I hadn't just survived the year. I'd built an entire life out of the wreckage of the old one, brick by deliberate brick, the same way I'd once built 3 boutiques out of a single storefront that smelled like a dry cleaner. It turns out I was good at that particular kind of construction, long before Nathaniel ever gave me a reason to test it on my own life instead of just my business. A year is a strange unit of time. In the thick of it, that year had stretched out ahead of me like a slow, anxious enemy I wasn't sure I had the stamina to outlast. Looking back on it now, it feels almost generous. Long enough to burn one entire life down to the studs, and just long enough, it turns out, to build a completely different one in its place. These days, I start my mornings in a penthouse with a sweeping view of Manhattan waking up beneath me. The air on my balcony carries that particular mix of exhaust and ambition and new beginnings that I've come to genuinely love. I don't live in that big house full of bitter memories anymore. I sold it, finally, cleanly, once the divorce was done. I didn't just move on physically, I moved on in every way that actually counts. I look different too, if I'm honest. My hair is shorter now, a cut that frames my face in a way that reads as confident instead of careful. My closet isn't full of the soft, forgettable dresses I used to wear to avoid drawing attention at his firm's holiday parties. It's sharp blazers and custom pieces now, things that fit like they were made for the woman I actually am instead of the one I was trying to be. I'm not just the owner of 3 boutiques scattered across the city anymore, either. Whitman and Company has a name now that's starting to travel outside New York entirely, into rooms I used to only read about. That morning, I just wrapped a video call with my team. We're gearing up for our first flagship location outside the city in Chicago. Everything's on schedule, Elle, Walter reported, his face lighting up the screen. Suppliers and shippers are locked in. The design team just finished the interior renderings. We're right on track. That's wonderful, Walter, I said, and I meant every word of it. Thank you for all your hard work, and everyone else's. None of this happens without you. After the call, I made myself a strong black coffee and stood at the window with it, watching the skyline do what it does best, which is exist without asking anyone's permission. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier. Through his increasingly desperate lawyer, Nathaniel had tried a few last counterattacks, accusing me of fraud, of embezzlement, throwing around words that were supposed to sound frightening. Desmond's team dismantled every single one of them without breaking a sweat. It was proven, cleanly and repeatedly, that every transaction I'd made had been executed legally before any petition was filed, on assets that were mine, or my company's, to begin with. In the end, Nathaniel walked away with exactly what I'd decided to leave him. Half of what little sat in that household account, and the sole responsibility for a mortgage on a house he was eventually forced to sell. I think about him sometimes, still, but the sharp edges of that memory have worn down into something almost painless. It plays back now like a story about someone else entirely, a film I watched once instead of a life I lived. I understand now, in a way I couldn't at the time, that what he did was never a reflection of anything wrong with me. It was a reflection of exactly who he'd always been, underneath the good suits and the corporate charm. What I went through wasn't a failure. It was a trial by fire, and it forced something out of me I'm not sure I would ever have found otherwise. I feel whole now, steady, and, more than anything else, free. On the other side of the city, in a cramped studio in an aging walk-up, Nathaniel is dragging himself through a different kind of existence entirely. He'd had no choice but to sell the big house once he couldn't keep up with the payments alone. After settling the bank and the rest of his debts, there wasn't much left over. He's at a small firm now, for a fraction of what he used to make, doing the kind of work junior associates usually handle. One evening, or so I've heard, he sat alone on a worn-out sofa in a room lit only by the glow of his phone, scrolling through social media, the same habit that had quietly kicked off his entire downfall, now just another form of nightly self-punishment. His thumb stopped on a post from a business journal, a photo from an Entrepreneur of the Year ceremony. Center stage, in a deep burgundy gown, holding a crystal trophy, a woman with a wide, genuine smile. That woman was me. He apparently stared at that photo for a long time, not because of the haircut or the dress, but because of something in the way I was standing, some visible aura of a person who was actually, finally, happy, and not performing happiness for an audience. That version of me, he said in that voicemail I never returned, felt like a total stranger. Or maybe, more honestly, like the version of me he'd simply never bothered to look for. And that, apparently, was when the real realization hit him. What he'd thrown away wasn't just money, or real estate, or a company's worth of equity. It was a woman who had the mind to build an empire out of nothing, the spine to weather a war she never asked for, and the loyalty to have stood by his side through all of it, if he'd ever actually let her. Every quality of mine he'd quietly filed away as weakness, my patience, my decency, the way I kept trying long after most people would have walked. Those were never weaknesses at all. They were the load-bearing walls holding the whole structure up. He'd thrown away something real, chasing the shine off something that was never anything more than glass. Vanessa, for what it's worth, was long gone by then too. The last time he saw her, also just a photo online, she was posing affectionately with some other man, older, visibly wealthier. The cycle simply kept turning, and he was just one more person it had used up along the way. I heard he sat there in the dark a long time after he put the phone down that night. The only thing he had left, apparently, was the bitterness. Back in my own apartment, I set my coffee cup down on the counter and caught my reflection in the wide window facing the skyline. Behind me, the quiet, deliberate decor of a home I'd chosen every piece of myself. In front of me, an entire city lit up with things I hadn't done yet. I don't look backward much anymore. What happened is a lesson now, not a cell I'm still locked inside of. I called my sister that night, mostly just to hear her laugh about something small and stupid, the kind of call that has nothing to do with strategy or lawyers or spreadsheets titled Project Independence. Dana picked up on the second ring. "Hey, stranger. You survived the Chicago call?" "Barely," I said, laughing for real. "Walter's going to make me a very rich woman someday. Richer, I mean." "You're already disgustingly rich, Elle." "Fair point." We talked for almost an hour about nothing that mattered. Her kids, a bad date she'd been on, whether I was finally going to let her set me up with someone from her office. I told her no, the same answer I'd given for months, and for the first time it didn't feel like a wall I was hiding behind. It felt like an honest answer from someone who genuinely liked her own company these days. After we hung up, I stood there a while longer, coffee gone cold in my hand, thinking about how strange it is that the worst night of my life, the one where I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and watched something cold and clear catch fire behind my own eyes, turned out to be the exact night everything good in my life afterward actually started. Nathaniel thought he was ending something that night at dinner all those months ago. In a way, I suppose he was right. He just never understood what. With a small, steady smile, I turned away from the window, ready for whatever the next day was going to ask of me. The sun was already coming up over the water, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, that sunrise belonged entirely, unmistakably, to me. I should tell the story of that awards night properly, because Nathaniel only ever saw it as a photograph on a screen, a flattened, second-hand version of something that felt, from the inside, like the actual closing of a much longer story. The Entrepreneur of the Year Gala was held in a ballroom downtown, The kind of room with high ceilings and low lighting designed to make everyone in expensive clothing look slightly more important than they actually were. I'd been nominated in the retail category, a fact I'd tried for weeks beforehand to treat with a kind of studied indifference, telling Walter and Dana both that it didn't matter whether I won, that the nomination itself was the real accomplishment. I don't think either of them believed me, and honestly, neither did I. I wore a burgundy gown I'd had made specifically for the occasion, deep, saturated color, a fabric I'd chosen myself from a mill in Italy I'd been sourcing from for years by then. Getting dressed that evening, standing in front of the same kind of full-length mirror I'd once stood in front of at 2 in the morning with tears drying on my face, I caught myself thinking about that other night, the one that had started everything. I didn't look anything like that woman anymore, and it wasn't just the dress or the haircut. Something in the way I actually stood had changed, some fundamental shift in how much space I let myself take up in a room. Dana came as my date, since I hadn't especially wanted to bring anyone else, and my mother insisted on meeting us there separately so she could, in her words, make her own dramatic entrance. She did too, showing up in a deep green dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, looking, at 71, more radiant than half the women decades younger than her in that room. "You look like you belong here," she told me, squeezing my hand before we found our table. "Not like you're pretending to belong here. Like you actually do." The retail category was announced about halfway through the evening, after 2 rounds of dinner courses I barely tasted, and one uncomfortable conversation with an industry acquaintance who'd clearly heard some version of the Nathaniel story and kept steering the conversation toward it with a curiosity dressed up as concern. I deflected as gracefully as I could manage, and was relieved when the lights dimmed for the award presentations. They read the nominees first. 4 other names. All people I respected, all of whom had built genuinely impressive things over the past year. When they read my name last, and L. Whitman, founder and CEO of Whitman and Company, I felt Dana's hand find mine under the table and squeeze hard enough to hurt slightly. When they announced my name as the winner, the room went a little blurry for a moment. Sound arriving half a beat behind everything else, the particular disorientation of hearing something you've hoped for so intensely you'd stopped letting yourself actually expect it. I remember standing, remember my mother's face, bright and fierce with pride. Remember Dana practically shoving me toward the aisle because I'd frozen for a second too long in my chair. I don't remember most of the walk to the stage. I remember the weight of the crystal statuette when they handed it to me, heavier than I expected, cool against my palms. I remember the microphone and a brief, terrifying blank moment where I genuinely didn't know what I was going to say, followed by words that came out steadier than I felt. "Thank you," I said. "This past year has taught me more about what I'm actually capable of than the 6 years before it combined, and not always in ways I expected or would have chosen for myself. I want to thank my team, especially Walter Higgins, who has been with this company since it was one cramped storefront in Chelsea that smelled like a dry cleaner, because it used to be one. I want to thank my sister, who has answered every single phone call I've made her over the last year regardless of the hour. And I want to thank my mother, who taught me, a long time before I ever needed the lesson, that the people who actually believe in you show it by showing up, not by saying nice things at dinner parties." I paused, and something made me add one more line, unplanned, that I'd think about often in the months that followed. "I built this company on my own. I almost lost half of it to someone who thought I was too soft, too distracted, too in love with him to notice what he was doing. I didn't lose it. And I think the lesson in that, for anyone in this room who's ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, is that being underestimated is occasionally the single greatest advantage you'll ever be handed. Use it well." The applause that followed felt different from ordinary polite applause, sharper somehow, like something in the room had actually landed rather than just been performed at. I found out afterward that at least 3 women had approached my mother during the reception to say some version of the same thing, that the line about being underestimated had struck something in them they hadn't expected to feel struck by at an industry awards dinner. I don't know if Nathaniel ever heard that part of the speech, whether the version of the story that eventually reached him through a phone screen included any audio at all, or just the photograph, the crystal statuette, the burgundy dress, the smile he apparently didn't recognize. I suspect it was only ever the photograph. Some stories only ever reach certain people in fragments, filtered down to whatever a screen happens to capture, and I've made my peace with the fact that he'll likely never understand the full shape of what actually happened that year. Not the way Dana does, not the way my mother does, not the way I do, lying awake some nights still turning the details over like stones in my palm. Chicago opened 4 months after that gala, on a bright, cold morning in a neighborhood I'd fallen in love with the first time I walked its blocks scouting locations. I flew out for the opening myself, cut the ribbon myself, stood in the doorway of a store considerably larger and more polished than that first cramped Chelsea location had ever been, and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as arrival. Not an ending. An arrival at a version of myself I'd been quietly building toward for longer than I'd realized. Longer, certainly, than the 2 months it had taken to dismantle a marriage and rebuild a company's ownership structure from scratch. Walter flew out with me. So did my mother, who insisted on being photographed in front of the new storefront, arms crossed, sunglasses on, looking, she informed the local reporter covering the opening, like the woman who financed the whole operation, because I did, and somebody should say so. I laughed harder at that than I had in months, standing there on a Chicago sidewalk in the cold, watching my 71-year-old mother charm a reporter half her age into printing a quote that would eventually run, verbatim, in a business section 2 states away from where any of this had started. People ask me sometimes, now, whether I regret any part of what I did that year. The lying, the careful, patient months of pretending to be someone smaller and softer than I actually was, right up until the night I wasn't anymore. I've thought about that question honestly, more than once, usually late at night, usually with a glass of wine and the same skyline view I've grown to love from my own window. I don't regret it. I regret, if anything, that it was necessary at all. That 7 years of genuine partnership could unravel so completely into a man calling me weak from behind a closed door, that it took a betrayal that specific and that cruel to reveal what I was actually capable of. But given that it happened, given that I found myself sitting in front of a mirror at 2 in the morning with a choice to make, I wouldn't have made a different one. I took back what was mine. Every dollar, every share, every square foot of a life I'd built with my own 2 hands, my own sleepless nights, my own risk. Nathaniel got to keep the past, whatever version of it he's telling himself these days in that studio apartment in an aging walk-up, scrolling through photographs of a woman he apparently never actually knew. I got the future. And every single morning since, watching the sun come up over a skyline that finally, entirely, belongs to me, I understand exactly how good a trade that turned out to be.